In honor of today, since we're talking about gender myths, I have my Golden Girls mug. Stay golden. You know, if you have you watched Golden Girls much at
I've
all?
I've I've not. I uh, I know that it's like a classic, but I've not watched it.
So you're not familiar with these actresses at all?
I mean, I'm familiar with Betty White.
Yeah. So like, I mean, if you had to guess, which of the Golden Girls do you most feel like resonance and kinship with?
I don't know, probably Betty White,
Just because
but
that's the
that's
only one you
also the
know?
only that's the only one I know.
Um, I think she's from Minnesota canonically, but I'll let you have her. I'm gonna just be a little sassy and go with Blanche. She was the group slut, and so
Okay.
yeah, showing that the retirees can still live their best lives. Um,
Yeah.
anyways, uh, all joking aside, well, we'll probably still keep on joking, but this is a
Yeah, let's
serious
look at joke.
topic. At
Yeah.
least if you talk to the federal government about it, the
Or
idea of gender.
really any politician, because
Well, and any
yeah,
trans person in particular.
or any trans person or any conservative person
Just for
who
different reasons.
yeah. So really the only people not worrying about it are like the liberal centrists, which
Mhm.
in any other country is considered a conservative, but that's yeah.
Yeah. You know, I will say one positive thing about centrists. They have really powerful upward body strength because of how many times they've had to throw us under the bus.
It's
Like,
true.
they've really bulked up. So,
Yeah. Gotta get that
good for
upper body,
them.
get the
Good for
arms.
them.
Gotta use your core with that too.
Lift with your legs, not your back. Yeah, and all
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So yeah, gender ideology. Is it new? uh like first let's just understand what an ideology is. It is a set of beliefs that a person has, generally that they do not recognize that they hold, because it's something that is internalized and subconscious for the most part.
It's funny how the word ideology only really gets tossed out as a negative, as an accusation
Mhm.
against other people. So the number of people who talk about the dangerous transgender ideology, for
Mhm.
example, acting as though they have no ideology is it's just
Yeah.
wonderful. If it weren't so
It
consequential.
yeah. It's the normalization. Like you can't have normalization of anything without an ideology, and you can't point out that somebody else has an ideology without accepting the fact that I'm okay. So people do it all the time, but in reality, uh, if you are pointing out somebody else has an ideology over anything, that automatically means that you yourself do have an ideology. Because if
Mhm.
you are saying theirs is wrong, then inevitably you're saying mine is right. Um, but yeah, it is an ideology nonetheless.
Yeah, it's just good to be honest about when you're arguing or saying anything incisive or challenging against somebody else's ideology or beliefs. It's just generally good to be honest about your own. Like,
Yeah,
be aware of your own like assumptions and core convictions and be open-handed with them and don't hide them. So then you can actually say, like when someone says the Bible condemns gay people or something, that's an ideological position, and people
yeah.
should be honest with that about that, but they're not.
And like you can't necessarily say the Bible says it, so I believe it. Like it is literally an interpretation based off of your ideology. That
Mhm.
like the truth is, especially in theology, like nobody has a theology that is solely based off of their understanding of Scripture. Their understanding of Scripture comes almost entirely from their ideology, and it rarely does like somebody's understanding of Scripture change their ideology. It's normally the other way around.
Yep.
Which kind of means that like that whole slippery slope idea that
Mhm.
people have, where like if you start accepting this, then you're gonna yeah, that's kind of true, because once you start changing your ideology, like you do change your interpretation. But that's also kind of like recognizing patterns and saying that the patterns are bad. um, like growth actually means that you're going to change. Growth means
Hmm.
you have different ideologies than you started with. So really, the threat of the slippery slope is if you do this, you might grow as a person.
Yeah, and this there's also things involved. And I don't want to go too deep into defining ideology, but with the issue of gender in particular, there's
Mhm,
often a gut reaction that is
mhm,
so strong that there's an attempt to kind of create a logic to explain that gut reaction. So usually
yeah,
when someone rejects transgender reality, um, they'll kind of just be like, it's just common sense. It's
mhm,
crazy talk, as though it's just readily apparent, obvious in all the ways that gender is a binary. That's how most people have seen it. And the only people who have deviated from that are those that, like, in this weird postmodern Western late stage capitalism where everything goes kind of right. Um, and they don't interrogate that fundamental assumption.
yeah,
It seems weird to them. It seems obviously weird to them. Therefore, it must be an aberration. The idea
yeah,
that somehow this has been part of the human experience since there's been a human experience just seems so unfathomable that they won't even entertain the possibility.
yeah. And honestly, if people are interested in understanding that like gut reaction, which is it's a almost a gag reaction
Mhm.
to the idea of trans people. M- uh, I don't know if you know her, but my friend Billy Horde has done a lot of work on that. And yeah, we might need to get her on the show at some point. Um, but yeah, like that's actually a trained reaction, a
Yeah.
trained cultural reaction that sets up um ways that that society is supposed to respond to anything that is not established as normative. Um, but something more that you said is like this idea, i- the idea that trans people are new, um, doesn't actually meet reality. So it's literally an ideology to believe that trans people are somehow new, because
Mhm.
uh, trans people have been, or I should say, gender expansive people have been around for basically, well, as long as we've had written history, and there's evidence to suggest that there were gender expansive people before written language was even a thing, and we see that in Neolithic artwork from like Greece that date to roughly 9,000 years ago, which is quite a
Yeah.
bit, quite a bit of time.
There's this whole idea of naturalizing something, and bringing up Billy Horde's work. Um, there's all sorts of studies on infrahumanization, like
Mhm,
is kind of what's called. Lysana Harris, Susan Fisk are two scholars that have written about this, and we tend to think our disgust response is a natural response, but it is. It's
mhm,
wired in. So
yeah,
um, the people like that EU feeling, one of the things that it does is it instantly dehumanizes someone. Like
mhm.
the part of your brain that recognizes someone's humanity, the medial prefrontal cortex,
Is that what it
lights
is?
yeah, lights up when you recognize a human face. If there's a disgust response present, it short circuits that. And so that's why homeless people are usually perceived as almost like
Non-human.
objects,
Yeah,
non-human, not just at a metaphorical or policy sense, but physiologically, because we've been wired to elicit disgust as a
yeah,
response to that.
yeah.
The same thing for when we go to war. There's a reason why there are animalistic caricatures of our enemies,
Mhm.
so that they elicit some sort of disgust response. And with the queers, I remember when I first came out, when I first came out, I didn't go full femme right away. It was a process. And so when I was still largely masculine presenting, um, kind of at least, and I was wearing makeup, I'd get all kinds of ew, gross, disgust response things with emojis on social media. And, you know, it's just kind of dehumanizing. Like there's no way around
Yeah.
it. I was just,
Yeah.
and even that one, like the idea of someone who's masculine presenting wearing makeup. I mean, there's been so much of human history where that's just normal.
Like makeup was, if I remember right, makeup was created for men in Egypt. So, um,
When,
but
of
I mean,
course,
that's
all the powdered wig dudes in all those
yeah,
movies or with the rouge, men peacocked as much as women. These are very fluid concepts, and we somehow think that 1950s Americana is the default human setting, which is
which is
a-
interesting because
arrogance.
that also means the default human setting is like segregation as well. But that's
It's a whole other,
kind of besides the point there. Um, but yeah, that response of dehumanization, but it's not just it's not just the like gag response um that dehumanizes, but we also within our culture, Melissa Wilcox has done work on this that talks about the sexualization of anybody who isn't a white cishet male, because that is the dominant group within our culture. And every step that you get away from the cishet white male, the more sexualized a person becomes. And so, like, white women are more sexualized than uh, white white cishet men because white cishet men are non-sexed in this view. In our world, we do not necessarily see white men as being uh, sexual. Which is an interesting concept. Uh, but the more that you get away from that, like the more that you add adjectives
Hmm.
to things, and that doesn't mean that the dominant group doesn't have adjectives, is that we erase them to normalize it. So like
Hmm.
at the end of the day, a black black lesbian trans femme person is seen as the most uh sexually deviant because it is like the person that is the furthest from the dominant group. And so because we have such an understanding of sexuality being a negative thing, which that's an entire topic,
Ugh.
um like we dehumanize based off of our perception the of the way that we sexualize groups of people. And so it's very ingrained. Like we like our culture is incredibly set up to view trans people or gender expansive people as something that is not supposed to be accepted as human.
Um, Speaking of dehumanizing, just to kind of like cast the current political situation, because there's been in this idea, and I'm gonna name David Chappelle here. Um, you know,
Again,
back yeah,
we talked
back in
about
the
Chappelle
day,
with Benji.
like um, when he started like including, first they were a little bit more subtle, and then they became more overt digs against trans women, as though trans people have had such great success being mainstreamed and having political power. There's this
Mhm.
idea, right? And as he was saying that, the states were starting to roll out anti-trans laws, and I still encounter this idea that this is the conservative talking point that transgender ideology is part of the ideology of the elite somehow. That somehow you and I, as trans women, have some kind of clout or cachet or are cool or whatever. Um,
Mhm.
and that idea, like I remember when I first came out, I had people suggest, "Wow, you're going to get all sorts of great. This is good for your career. You're going to get all kinds of speaking gigs now." Because
Yeah,
like I
that's
guess
not true.
because I'm exotic or something. No,
Yeah.
I lost so many professional connections and friends
Mhm.
because of it. Like it didn't help me financially at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's been
I
a
mean,
big
if you
problem.
just look at if you just look at statistics, trans people, especially trans women, face higher rates of unemployment, face higher rates of violence, face higher rates of police brutality. Uh, the wage gap is much higher for trans people than for cis people. Like
Mhm.
the idea that it is somehow an elitist thing is really interesting because you're getting that idea from literally the elites. Like the
Mhm.
in the last election, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent to target trans people.
Yeah,
I
which
don't
is
know if you
we
understand how much like that's a lot of money for 1% of the population.
it's it's to me, it's a lot it's very similar to how gayness was treated in the 80s and 90s, like, suddenly it seemed cool and everyone was gay, like, there aren't that many gay characters still on TV. I mean,
Mhm.
speaking of Golden Girls, there's the new show Mid-Century Modern, which is a gay male riff off of Golden Girls.
Okay.
It's not bad. It has Nathan Lane in it, kind of a living god amongst the gays. But also, um, you know, black people in television were kind of treated that way in this, 70s and 80s, as though, wow, Bill Cosby's on television. That must mean the black man has ascended to power. Just because it seemed like an aberration, right? It
Yeah.
was out of the normal, and so people notice it, and they fail to notice the generic sea of whiteness. And it's the same now. Like, just because there's a Laverne Cox who has some success doesn't mean that trans people
Yeah,
have
those are
arrived in
the
power.
outliers.
They're outliers, but they get attention, and so then people think, because I'm noticing it, it must be prevalent. And you get this kind of logic baked into this whole fear of social contagion, that children are being uh, like coming out as trans or questioning gender because of social contagion, because it's cool and popular. Which, if anybody's ever talked to a trans kid who's in school, they're not usually considered popular. I have yet to meet a popular trans kid. Usually, it's really difficult. And if there are exceptions, it's just a testament to how awesome that school is, because it's
Yeah.
just not normal to be treated
There
well.
there are schools where trans kids are not necessarily at a social disadvantage. That doesn't mean that they have an advantage. Most of them, uh, most of them still have normal teenage stuff that goes on. But that's kind of like the thing is like like succeeding is whenever trans people face normal stuff, which
Hmm.
is fair. Like, um, uh, but it's rare. Like you're talking about schools in progressive, like the most progressive sections of the most progressive cities in certain states, and that's not everywhere. That's not the majority. There is still quite a few issues with when people come out when they're not in that type of school system that are significant. Like uh, you can't you can't say that trans people have an advantage whenever you have literal lawmakers in your state calling trans people trash, trans children trash.
Hmm.
That like like yeah, but
Um, yeah, just maybe I have a few tabs open here just to kind
okay,
of show the stakes. Maybe it'd be good to like show the actual stakes here, because there's been um, four executive orders from the Reich master, Donald Trump, about trans people. Now, four since January 20th or whatever. So like this is just a
yeah,
few months worth. And just to glaze over at least each of these, so people understand the extent to which trans people are being vilified, particularly trans women. I mean, this
mhm,
is really, I don't want to like somehow say that it's easy if you're trans masculine, but the narrative for transmasculine people is, oh no, that's a tragedy. Um, the narrative
Well, but
often,
specifically, that's a tragedy because they might not have children, which also means that we
Mhm.
hypersexualize bodies assigned female at birth and give the only like value to them as their ability to create babies,
yeah,
which is messed up. Like, come
yeah, and if you
on, people.
and, and among like turfy, feminists, turf being trans exclusionary radical feminists, or just uh, transphobes who think they're feminists, basically. Part of the
Yeah,
tragedy
there's
is,
no
oh no,
trans exclusive feminists.
we lost another woman to the ideology.
Yeah.
She should have just been a butch lesbian, like that kind of. But for
Hmm.
trans women are usually seen as we're either kind of clownish or we're predators. We're seen
Hmm.
as deviants and threats. And so usually the subtext here is a particular fear of trans femininity. I'm going to pull this up now. Um, Here we go. Boom. So let's start with the first one chronologically. Uh, Defending women from gender ideology, extremism, and restoring biological truth to the federal government. Um, basically, like I'm not going to read all this one. This one is just kind of more the most straightforward of them in a sense. It's like basically we're going to scrub all of the government documents to erase anything that's trans
Yeah.
and restore
But
gender binary.
it accidentally makes everybody female because that is, yeah, because it's either as male or female depending on the um the sexual characteristics at conception,
Mhm.
which uh, um
Everyone's female at conception.
everyone's
This is
female at conception because it's based off
everyone's
of,
trans.
yeah.
We
So if you're
won.
male, you're trans. Um, which congratulations to Donald Trump uh as, as the first female president because of his executive order. Slow clap for
Yeah, so just the policy and definition. It is the policy of the United States to recognize two sexes, male and female. These sexes are not changeable and are grounded in fundamental and incontrovertible reality. Under my direction, the executive branch will enforce all sex protective laws to promote this reality, and the following definition shall govern all executive interpretation and application of federal law and administrative policy. So it just goes into the generic things you'd expect.
yeah.
Now, this sets up a groundwork for them to understand the gender binary within the legal system, um,
Mhm.
which uh, makes us not real. Like, so at the very least, most generous, if we're going to be the most generous we can be with this, with conservative types, they might not, if they're libertarian about it, they might say, look, those dudes who think they're women, like they shouldn't be oppressed, but like they don't need special status. Like that's kind of the generic way
Mhm.
conservatives want to think about it. And that's bad enough. But this lays the groundwork for three more executive orders. So then we have the next one. Um,
Well, but before we move too far
okay,
on, I do want to
sure.
highlight one, like the idea that sex is a binary that is very easily determined is, it's not scientific. The
No.
both sex and gender, first of all, both sex and gender are in fact
Yes.
social constructs. They are ideas developed to put language to something that is observable within nature. That is what a social construct is. This is our working understanding to talk about something. That doesn't mean that it's not real. It's just it does highlight the fact that it is still dependent on our understanding of what we observe. That's hugely important because even within biology, like there are multiple things that go into determining sex and gender. There are chromosomes, there are um, the development of genitals, there is the hormones that are produced during puberty. There's a few others, but those are also interchangeable. They are not set.
Mhm.
They might be the way that things work the majority of the time, but we're talking about the outlier of that 1%, like where where sex and where perceived sex is not actually what is happening. That is what we're talking about. We're talking about the outliers whenever we're dealing with this. So the fact of the matter is, scientifically speaking, gender isn't a binary, because that is not scientific. Science like understands that gender is not one single factor. It
Mhm.
it yeah. And then on top of that, gender is like more of the social aspect of our social construct around sex, which has changed throughout history.
Well, and then, on top of these sorts of biological things that then, you know, influence social things, you get kind of this assumption over what the biological male and the biological female, how they're supposed to act. This is when you
Mhm,
get really into this sort of conservative ideology intensely. It's all about reinforcing patriarchy and certain hierarchies. And I brought this up, pulled this up while you're talking, uh, and it matters here. J.K. Rowling, may she hopefully soon rest in peace. Um, I'm kidding. Um,
it's a joke.
it's a
We
joke. Is mad at more letters than just the T in LGBTQIA plus. So there she is.
Mhm,
Basically, it was recently um, Asexual Awareness Day,
mhm.
and she posted something on her Twitter like,
I've
uh,
made up a press group.
yeah, she's like, Happy International Fake Oppression Day to everyone who wants complete strangers to know they don't fancy a shag." So here's the thing, like, this paragon of feminist virtue, why does she have an issue with people claiming agender? Now, the
I
reason
mean,
why, or asexual, the
asexual.
reason why, asexual, the reason why is because um, her whole issue with being anti-trans is not feminist. She
No,
actually
absolutely not.
believes in a certain kind of like
She should
assumptions
still,
about what it means to be a sexual being,
yeah.
including it just you don't like having sex. It's who cares? That's not a thing. She wants to collapse everything down, and this is what the binary ideology does.
Mhm.
It just wants to prescribe things so that it follows this idea of a natural order that we've inherited from pretty much from the church, from
Yeah.
conventional historical understandings of Christian, uh, you know, morality and ethics. But she doesn't want to name that. I don't think she's a Christian, or
No,
maybe
I
she
think
is.
she
Maybe she
is
isn't.
actually. I if I remember, I think that she was some form of like Methodist or something like that.
Yeah,
But ultimately, her view of gender is highly patriarchal and is misogynistic when it comes down to it, because she
yeah.
doesn't. She talks a lot about um, the like the concept of womanhood, but it's always from a woman's relationship to a man. It is producing babies. It is having a feminine form. It is presenting publicly in feminine ways that have been established by men. It's not a type of feminism. It is literally just saying, I get my value out of what men say I have to do. And
I'm
that's her entire thing.
Yeah, and she's kind of more than anyone else encouraged this trend towards transvestigation. Any
Mhm.
um, physically imposing looking woman who does well in sports, she'll start declaring that they're trans before there's any evidence to suggest that.
Right.
Because and this ties into racism, the way that uh, trans or the way that black women have often been seen as less than because of
Less
their
feminine.
less feminine, and therefore part of their why they're less human because they're more
Mhm.
bestial. Like I'm not. we're not making this stuff up. Like pretty much everything that's been being said about trans women in sports was said about black women in sports at one point.
It's
I
still
mean, it's
being
the
said
same.
about black women in sports,
It's
like,
just
to be
people are
honest.
try to be a little bit more polite about
Yeah.
it, but even yeah, even then. Uh,
And
so
on the topic of sports, like, I did get permission from my sister to talk about this because I knew it'd probably come up. My sister and I started marathon training around the same time, and this is after I transitioned. Now, before I transitioned, I was always good at running. Um, like in high school and stuff, I was always faster than my sister. When I was in the military, I could not run the entire year and still run my once a year PT test without training and pass. And granted, it's the Air Force, it's not as hard as other branches. I get it. However, you're not supposed to be able to do a desk job for an entire year and then one day go and run the mile and a half within within reason to score high enough to only take the PT test once a year. It's not supposed to happen. So I am
mm,
good at running. Like I am naturally good at running.
mhm,
Uh, my sister now that I've transitioned is faster than me by we she can run a marathon probably uh 45 minutes faster. Well, I can't run a marathon anymore because my knees died after my last one, but um
mm,
like 45 minutes faster than me. And we have this very similar genes, very similar body types, both very naturally athletic. Um, yeah, and if we were to believe the transphobic ideology around trans women, I should still be faster than her because I was when I was in high school. That's not how it works. I am significantly less strong. I am uh, have less endurance, have less speed, and, I think the fact that my sister is so much better and granted, my sister is naturally good at running, but it really kind of proves, like, whenever you're good at a sport, it is mostly, like, kind of luck of the draw. Uh, and the truth of the matter is transition does affect the way that you are able to do athletics,
mhm,
and I feel like my sister and I are a very good example because, on paper on paper, we should be relatively similar. And if you go by gender critical ideologies, I should be better at running than my sister, and I'm
should
not.
be dominating,
Should be
which
dominating. I should be winning these marathons. No,
yeah, but you're not.
my marathon is 5 hours. Like it's just not fast.
Um, surprisingly, like I'm not good at running, but apparently, after I transitioned, I decided to just do a marathon, and I beat all of the women because just of the power that having been born assigned male at birth gives me. That's kind of the
Mhm.
assumption they're making. I mean,
It's the assumption.
most of these, most, like people will often point out, like there's only a handful of trans athletes.
Mhm.
Um, you know, they try to inflate these numbers as though like I think the number is 900 cis girls or women have been denied winning something because of a trans person. Um, and that has been shown to be methodologically flawed. They counted people multiple times, and we're talking about since 2021, and
Mhm.
based upon the millions of people. So it's still a small fraction. But when people point out the relative infrequency of trans athletes, um, that's somehow saying that somehow if every trans person who is trans came out and started doing athletics, and there were like more of us, then maybe then we should consider whether or not trans women shouldn't be in sports. That's kind of the logic there, and I hate it because
It's terrible logic.
the
Yeah.
reality is like you're never going to see somehow trans women dominating all of women's sports. It's just not going to happen because that's not how it works.
Yeah, and
Especially, yeah.
and a lot of sports that we think are hyper masculine, not aren't. necessarily like gender specific for being better. Like
Mm.
the fact like tennis, there was the battle of the sexes where um I don't remember their names, but the woman won that match, right? Um
Was
the
that
fact of the matters, uh if do you remember their names?
I'm gonna
I
look it up because I wanna
okay,
know.
you look it up while I rant on this. Like baseball banned women from professional baseball because a 17-year-old girl struck out Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig back to back. Like
Um, I found it
two of
here.
probably the two of probably the best batters like at that time at least struck them out both. And Babe Ruth got so mad that he's like, I don't think women can do this because they're not their bodies can't handle traveling and stuff. And the day after, like her contract was ended, and then they banned women from sports because a woman did so good that she showed up like two of the best athletes at the time. And that's not to say that women and men are equal in all sports, and because that's not necessarily what I'm saying. What I am saying is our understanding of that there has to be a separation of genders. A lot of that originated from misogynistic understandings. And yeah, like look at
Yeah.
women being banned from running marathons because they didn't think that they claimed that women didn't have the body type to be able to run 26.2 miles, and so they shouldn't even be allowed to try. That is a terrible that's a terrible excuse whenever the reason is you don't want women beating men.
Mhm.
That's plain and simple why marathons didn't allow women until was it the 1920s or something like that? I don't know when it
Yeah,
was, but yeah.
there's I feel like there's a need for research in this area, like, I'm not gonna somehow say, um people always bring up these ridiculous ideas like, what if Mike Tyson decided to transition and so like a week later was boxing against women? That's usually the scenario they give. And
No
that's
sport, no sport
no,
has that. The
nobody has that.
the soonest that you can compete in a women's sport is 1 year on uh well, okay, not every sport. I'm going to tell you the
Some have
exception,
two
but most
years.
sports.
Yeah.
Yeah, most sports, the least is 1 year. The
Mm,
only sport that I know of that doesn't require that is roller derby, specifically women's flat track roller derby. Um, I know that because I am in roller derby, and I'm working through the academy system, and it's a lot of fun. Uh, but that is also an entire like league that is designed to include trans people.
mhm. Uh, the battle of the sexes, just for the people watching who want to know this historical, there's been a number of them, but the big one is the 1973 tennis match between
Mhm.
Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs. Bobby Riggs being a male chauvinist piece of crap, and so Jean King just schooled him at tennis.
Yeah,
So um, it happens. It's not,
it does.
I think the question here is, uh, Eh, we should just not we think we know, that men are somehow dominant in
Mhm.
sports when that's just not true across the board. There may be
Yeah,
specific areas like boxing, for example, but, we should
or
just
like football, like
we sh should suspend our assumptions and then look at what we can actually verify, rather than just assuming that our common sense is sufficient to make these decisions. Um,
yeah,
this
I did a short I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're good.
I did a short video on common sense that made a lot of people very upset because the idea of
I
common
saw
sense,
that.
yeah, the idea of common sense is actually only supposed to apply to simplistic things that don't require nuance. Um, once you get out of that realm, you're not supposed to rely on common sense anymore. Um, like that's just what it is. And so the idea that you rely on common sense for something as complicated as gender and sports, um, you are already like you're already just given into your ideology at that point, for lack of any other explanation. Because like the truth is, if you have trans people in sports and you don't know for sure like how they are going to perform in comparison to cis people, you don't just ban them. You actually do research. You look at the different abilities. You see what happens over time. You take into consideration things like uh the fact that we spend a lot more money and effort training young boys in sports than we do young girls. So like male children are getting better education in sports than female children in sports because we prioritize that. So yeah, if somebody grew up in a male sport, being given that better like training and education, they're probably going to do better than somebody else who didn't have that. Like
Mhm.
for instance, in roller derby, I actually can hit really pretty good. In some of that is because I do have naturally powerful legs, but also when I was a teenager, I played football and I learned back then how to get low and keep my body weight correct whenever I hit somebody, something that a lot of people in derby are just now learning. And so like that is a huge difference right there, is that I have past experience that was given to me because I was perceived male as a child that I'm able to like pull on, that is helping me uh within roller derby. Now, I'm saying that as like I'm coming up in the ranks and trying to get higher. There are people that are like up high, much higher in like this league that are totally going to just knock me on my ass because my experience from back then is only going to get me so far, and the truth is I am never going to be as good as some of the people um
Mhm.
that are higher up in the sport. But like there's so the point of that is to say there's so many factors that it is not just strength, it is also the education, the social influence on children. All of these things need to be examined before we even start to come to like uh, a, a conclusion on what how we should move forward. And the fact that people don't want to do that is telling that they actually don't care. They
Mhm.
care about um, keeping trans people out of the spotlight, keeping trans people hidden away from society, and specifically, they actually want trans people to not exist because ultimately they don't like being reminded that trans people exist. They don't want trans people around. So it's literally that is the reason behind it. Because if you cared about maintaining women's sports, then you would want the research, you would want the analytics, but people don't want that.
They don't. There haven't been enough studies on this because of that very reason. People just assume that transness, um, doesn't have any right to exist. Which then you get to, go into these other executive orders real quick because 'cause they're so
Oh
much
yeah.
fun. Uh, yeah, so we have, protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation. So just to read the opening here. Across the country today, medical professionals are maiming and sterilizing a growing number of impressionable children under the radical and false claim that adults can change a child's sex through a series of irreversible medical interventions. This dangerous trend will be a stain on our nation's history and it must end. And it goes on from there. So many myths in that. Um,
There's a lot going on there.
yeah,
Like,
like this.
first of all, there is no mutilation, there is no castration, because those are words used with intent behind them. Like,
Mhm.
it is you do not consider. First of all, like surgeries aren't happening on minors. That is one thing that is needs to be said, because it's yeah, it's not happening. But at the same time, like even if they were, right? We do not consider removing tonsils as mutilation, even though we're removing something from the body, right? We do not uh, consider removing a person's um, uh, pink
Appendix.
appendix, that's it, as mutilation. The only reason that we would necessarily say that surgery is mutilation is if one, we want to, we want to spread that misinformation and ignite that disgust response,
Hmm.
or two, we hyper prioritize genitals and think that reproduction and the ability to create babies is the ultimate purpose of humanity, which is in and of itself problematic
Hmm.
on lots of different levels.
Yeah, and there's other things here, like, yeah, one, uh, this idea that genital mutilation is happening to minors is just not true. To even get on hormone uh, therapy, um,
It
which
takes a lot.
isn't irreversible. I mean, there's a
It's
point after which it becomes irreversible in some cases, but it takes a lot to get
those are
on
the
there.
minority also.
Yeah, it takes a lot. There's Minnesota, which is one of the most progressive states when it comes to this. A kid can't get on hormones without both parents consenting, and there's a long process of therapy. And then, so that's why the general standard is for kids who are trans that have dysphoria is to do hormone blockers, which there's all this fear mongering about that. Um, and what's minimized is the idea, like, there's very real statistics about suicide um, and other harms to kids who aren't able to intervene on their puberty, right?
Mhm.
And so there's this idea that somehow what's really going on is they have some mental health issue that needs to be resolved legitimately, that
Yeah.
transitioning is illegitimate, and what they need is to stop being fucked up. And so the fact that there's such a high suicide rate is kind of swept aside. Meanwhile, these people who don't seem to care that much about high suicide rates are saying that the real risk is groomers like us trying to
Mhm.
tell kids that it's okay for them to be trans. They
Yeah.
want to make it
Let's
illegal to be trans. Is really what it
yeah.
comes down to. Uh,
Let, let's pick up on that groomer idea just for a second,
oh,
because
I
somebody
love
did
talking about it. So let's go.
somebody did the numbers on this, and it's quite telling. So in I'm pulling up the tab so I can read it. Between February 10th, 2023 and May 23rd, 2024. So just over a year, right?
Hmm.
Um, there were 10,885 cases of sexual violence against children.
Hmm.
Out of that, um, 846 were uh, were done by people that were employed or in leadership of a church or religious institution.
Hmm.
846. The number of trans people that made up that just over 10,000 was 5. So and on top of that, there is uh, trans people outnumber clergy by a significant amount. Like, clergy makes up maybe at most 600,000 people within the United States, right?
Hmm.
Um, Trans people are somewhere between like 1 to 3 million. I think people normally estimate 1.5 million trans people in the United States. So, so we're talking about there are 3 times the number of trans people in the United States than clergy, but clergy are um, committing sexual crimes against children at a rate of, let's do this math, divide by 169.2 to 1. So every time one trans person is arrested for sexual crimes against a child, 169.2 clergy slash church leaders have been arrested for sexual crimes against children. That is
Meanwhile,
significant.
like every single time a trans person harms a child or rapes a woman, um, we all know about it. Like J.K.
Mhm.
Rowling
Every
shares it.
single one.
I,
Yeah.
you know, I had got an argument with a dude who he brought up this article about a trans woman raping a cis woman, and I said that's anecdotal, which means
Yeah.
in the which is funny because like it's funny how people don't know how to do logic because anecdotal doesn't mean that it's dismissible and it's just opinion. Anecdotal means
Yeah.
it's a specific story that doesn't necessarily represent a statistical trend. It's
Yeah.
a one-off.
I mean,
So unless there's
also
one,
our president has been found guilty of being credibly accused of sexual abuse, and the judge said that according to the definition that he committed rape. But yet people don't care
that's
about
fake news. That's fake news.
fake news.
So
That's right. That's true.
um,
Sorry.
yeah. So this guy I was arguing with, I said that's anecdotal. He said no, it's not. Look, and then he shares this whole article which goes into vivid detail. Um, and, and those stories go out into the ether, and people pick
Mhm.
them up because it reinforces their ideological assumption,
Absolutely.
even though
And also,
statistically it doesn't bear out that way.
yeah,
This is
yeah,
why fascists hate science. Um,
yeah. It's why we're removing research on things that like shed truth on stuff like this because fascists don't like it. Uh, one of my favorite is the whenever people try to use the research that shows like 95% of trans women in prison are there on sexual crimes or something like that. I think that's about what it is.
mhm,
People are not reading the research on that because it is the number of trans women who are in trans I think it's trans women specifically who are in prison with a history of sexual crimes. So anybody who is in prison who doesn't have a sexual crime is excluded. And so all they're saying is of all the people who've been convicted of sexual crimes, 95% of them are currently in prison for a sexual crime. And that could be the one that like landed them in prison.
mhm.
It's a weird thing to research. First of all, is very specific. And like I'm sure it's accurate because it makes sense that it's accurate. But if you go looking for how many people in prison with a history of sexual crimes are there that are in prison for sexual crimes, you're going to get a very high number.
Mhm.
Congrats. Like it,
That's kind of what it's there. What?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like
Um, for some reason, my camera's a little blurry, but people can kind of see my. Oh, it clicked back in. Good.
okay.
I want to go through these last two executive orders just
Yeah,
so
let's do
people.
it.
Here we go. Uh, we've already talked about this one a bit. The keeping men out of women's sports. This is a February 5th executive order. We kind of know what that one says already. And then there's the last one, which is a doozy. And this is where I start getting scared with this
Yeah.
one.
This one
Um,
is
this is National Child Abuse Prevention Month, 2025. So, uh, this one's longer, um, but basically, and I want to read through it real quick because this is where things get consequential, this sort of rhetoric.
mhm.
America's children are the foundation of our families, heirs of our freedom, blah, blah, blah. All these sorts of nice, I believe the children are the future kind of thing.
Which
As a
he
citizen,
doesn't, but that's
yeah,
neither
as
here nor there.
as citizens, each of us is entrusted with the sacred responsibility of caring for the most vulnerable among us, especially children uniquely at risk of trauma and abuse. Uh, this is where it goes on to talk about child abuse is bad. Um, I call on every American to take steps to prevent child abuse and neglect before it occurs. By doing so, we can reduce the risk of depression, suicide, substance abuse, and developmental challenges in our youth. There, this last one is interesting, a rhetorical move, because
Mhm.
there's also there's this slowly building kind of war against neurodivergence happening within the administration as well. Um, Sadly, one of the most prevalent forms of child abuse facing our country today is the sinister threat of gender ideology. Proponents of the gender ideology movement are outrageously indoctrinating our children with the devastating lie that they are trapped in the wrong body and that the only way they can be truly happy is to alter their sex with hormone therapy, puberty blockers, and sexual mutilation surgery. The evil and backwards lies of gender insanity are robbing our children of their happiness, health, and freedom while imposing unimaginable heartbreak on parents and families. As I stated during my joint address to the Congress last month, my message to every American child is simple: you're perfect, exactly the way God made you. That's a statement right there.
This yeah, this is like proof that Trump didn't write this because Trump doesn't give a fuck about God.
No, it's
Not,
true.
not even a little bit. And yeah, he didn't write this. Let's be honest.
Yeah,
Maybe he had Chat GPT, but most likely somebody from the Heritage Foundation.
yeah. And as president, I proudly signed Executive Order 14187, prohibiting public schools from indoctrinating our children with transgender ideology, while also taking action to cut off all taxpayer funding to any institution that engages in the sexual mutilation of our youth. To further protect our children, I have taken historic action to secure our southern border and to end child trafficking. Wow, masterstroke. Anti immigrant, anti
Yeah,
trans,
and anti-trans.
and I'm
But
working
then
diligently to
again,
make
when
our young
he,
people healthy again. Oh, go ahead.
I was just gonna say when he ran on a threat of trans immigrants. So I guess it connects.
Yeah. Well, all these evils that they're trying to name are interwoven.
Yeah,
Um, this National Child Abuse Prevention Month, we pledge to stop the atrocity of child abuse in all of its forms. We affirm that every perpetrator who inflicts violence on our children will be punished to the fullest extent of the law. Above all, we vow to give our children the tools they need to fully embrace God's gift of life and to carry that radiant torch of American liberty generations into the future. And it goes on from there. Uh,
yeah.
this is
Let's
the problem with this is it essentially all these things set it up like we're the predators.
yeah.
All you have to
And this
do
is
is
coming from a man who has been accused of being a pedophile and raping a child. Um, was a friend of Jeffrey Epstein, a friend of Diddy, who have had child sex trafficking rings. Like
Mhm,
this is a guy who has a history of being very close friends with children traffickers. That is the person that was saying that, "Oh, it's gender ideology," which, first of all, binary gender ideologies is the new idea. Like I said before, like, gender expansive people have been attested to probably for the last 9,000 years, and the only reason we don't have his records earlier than that because we don't have records. Uh,
yeah,
the first civilization with writing was Sumer, and they had it, an understanding of gender expansive people that existed within their culture and were accepted. This is the first civilization with writing. So, as far back as we have human records, we have a view of gender expansive people. This idea
mhm,
that it's binary is incredibly new, and it's been hyper focused in Western society because that was a justification for genocide and colonialism, because
mhm,
they believed that they had the correct view of the world and the correct view of gender and sexuality and all of that. And so anything that didn't fall in their white supremacist view of how humanity should be, they killed off intentionally. Like, even I get that this wasn't caused specifically because of gender. Understandings of gender and sexuality, but like even George Washington carried out a genocide on an indigenous group that did have an expansive understanding of gender and sexuality. um that isn't necessarily connected in the sense like he didn't do it to target them because of that. However, his view of them and the view of indigenous people were shaped by the fact that early Americans, people settling in the United States, viewed them as less than human because they had ideas that were outside of the Western Eurocentric view of humanity. And so the hatred was already there. Like
Mm.
foundation, our first president carried out a genocide that was in fact uh, against queer people. Like,
And this is what's happening here. Like, people might think, wow, that's just hyperbolic to say genocide. This is setting up
it's not. Like,
this is setting up something genocidal towards trans people. Like, basically, take these executive orders. Like, we recently had the Supreme Court uphold Trump's ability to invoke the Alien Enemies Act against immigrants, which is an extraordinary perversion of what that act is supposed to be. Like, so and now they're, new numbers. They're taking away, uh, they've taken away rights of thousands of Venezuelans, but now they're going to remove legal status for up to 1 million more. They're talking about now. Um, and
yeah.
now, what happens when Trump is able to successfully invoke the Insurrection Act for enemies within? There's already the groundwork here of trans people being named intrinsically enemies because of a destructive ideological perspective.
Mhm.
And we mentioned this at the outset, like centrists, most of your standard liberal type Democrats have just took a step back. There aren't a lot of people fighting for us because they see us as a distraction to the main thing. Um, and
Which
this is,
should let everyone know that the main thing isn't human rights, first of all. Just just saying.
yeah. And
So
so
on
here's where we're at. This is
yeah,
we're on the cusp of things getting a lot worse. Things aren't going to
yeah.
go away around trans issues. It's been so successful for them to spend
Mhm.
uh,
Well,
tens and hundreds of millions of dollars investing on scapegoating trans people. They're going to keep doing it and
because
go worse.
abortion, they kind of won on abortion, so they can't highlight that as much, and also it's a losing thing right now.
Mhm.
Um, so they need something. But I know I should have shared the screen. I don't know if you can read this, but
Oh
it's
yeah,
the pyramid of hate. Like currently our political system is at the middle tier for trans people with which is
systemic
systemic
discrimination.
discrimination. That's happening. So we're halfway up to genocide. Um, culturally, we are already at the second to last one, the biased motivated violence. Um, which includes threats. And both of us have had threats, like on our platform. We get them,
It's pretty
we
normal
get
to
them
get
kind of,
threats.
yeah. Um, I posted something on my Facebook that like was it was a comment that somebody had posted under something I did because I've gotten to the point where I find it funny. But the person literally said that they hope that me and my family die in a fire and scream out for help. But if I'm remembering it right, um, something like that. But like I thought it was funny because I get it a lot. So like we are one step away from genocide of trans people
Mhm.
specifically because like that's where we are. Like that's the reality of the situation. And people can keep hiding their heads, but that's just the truth. Like you got to deal with it because it's right in front of you.
Mhm. And just to make this clear, like, there's this idea out there, going back to the kids thing, that children are being experiencing like rapid onset gender dysphoria because of social contagion. Now, uh, most
Yeah.
people I know who are parents of trans kids know better than that, because most parents I know who have trans kids didn't weren't just they didn't throw a party when their kid came out as trans. They were like, it's scary
Yeah.
because of the society we're in, and it's scary for the kid too. And so it's this
Mhm.
big long process of discernment. Now, and these parents that I know, are supporting their kids as best they can because they know what the alternative is. Now, this genocidal thing that we're talking about now, isn't just affecting middle-aged trans women. It's gonna like impact all of these kids. The very ones that Trump says he's protecting are gonna be on the chopping block.
Mhm.
Um,
And
this is serious shit. Even if you don't give a shit about our lives, you should care
yeah,
about their lives.
and a lot of this is removing the rights of children. And I think I talked about that before. Like parents' rights and children rights are not compatible necessarily. Children are humans. Children deserve human rights. Um, Children deserve to get a good education that is not centered around ignoring reality. The
Mhm.
idea that parents have rights over children in inherently means that that you have a belief that children do not have their own rights.
And it also allows you to have those parents abuse their children up into the
Hmm.
letter of the law, which
Yeah.
is to me denying them valid health care. We
Hmm.
recognize that if your kid is sick and you don't give them medicine, that could be considered a type of abuse by denying them health
Or
care.
should be. I
Um,
think I think Idaho just passed a law where it wouldn't be considered abuse, but it should be. Like if you're
mm,
denying your child healthcare because of whatever, like that is abuse, Uh, plain and simple.
yep.
And yeah, it's the dehumanization of children. As a parent, both of us are parents.
Mhm.
We do not have rights to our children. We have responsibilities.
That's right.
We So no, I do as a parent, I reject the idea of parents' rights.
Mhm.
I fully embrace parent responsibilities, but I believe in children's rights.
Mhm. And my child should be able to be cared for and have his health needs met. And if he came out as trans, he should get healthcare for that. Like, this is the idea. The idea that somehow all this is trans healthcare, like transitioning, that's such a hard pill for a lot of cis people to swallow. But it really is. Like, I would be dead if I hadn't transitioned. And I'm not just being hyperbolic. And most trans people I know aren't that far off from that, or they would say the same thing. And it's not
I
because we're delusional and crazy. It's because it was necessary healthcare.
and to be fair, that's like I don't know if I can say that because I transitioned really quickly out of recognizing I was trans,
Mhm,
um, which is a privilege. First of all, I want to say that because most people don't have that ability. So I didn't have to live very long with like this n- knowledge of the pieces that didn't fit together growing like up until that point finally fitting together. And I have to live with that with those pieces fitting together very long before I transitioned. Um, but like you have to like we have to understand that societies that do recognize gender expansive people, they recognize that to be a society that takes care of people, uh, you have to you have to do it in a way that takes care of them in the way that they need. Our society sucks at that. Our society thinks that the only people that need healthcare are healthy bodied cis het men. That's
mhm,
why there has been a disparity in medical research for women. It's why um, period products haven't used real blood in testing. It's why there has been a lack of research in diseases that predominantly affect Black people. Like the truth of the matter is, like our issue isn't that uh, trans people need trans healthcare. Our issue is that we still haven't figured out that we hyper focus on only needing healthcare for white men,
mhm,
and it, for some reason, finding out that somebody else needs a different type of healthcare than a white man uh, makes us freak out. Like people
yep,
still like part of that is like based in our culture where like men freak out because women have periods. That is a natural, healthy part, or people with uteruses have periods because trans men have periods too. That was my
mhm,
bad. Um, eh, like the fact that we still freak out about a natural human function and think that it's gross or wrong or whatever. Like, that's misogyny within our health system. It's misogyny in our understanding of human bodies. Like, we got to recognize that the issue isn't trans healthcare. The issue is medical misogyny.
Yep. We could go into,
We,
start bringing in health stuff. We can go into all kinds of directions with that. And, maybe we'll touch on these things, because when you start talking about health, you start talking about like the way it centers white men. It brings up issues like where the BMI came from, which is a
oh
huge,
yeah,
there's all kinds of things of how patriarchy and white supremacy have been baked in. And this is part of why trans women are in the crosshairs here. It's because our existence
subverts
challenges the
patriarchy.
hegemony of
Mhm.
white men, like of cis white men being the center of things. This
Mhm.
is why fascists almost always go after, gender and sexual deviance as part of their horrific regime of power. It's like, because we are contradictions to what they are asserting is natural and normal, and they have to
Mhm.
take us out of the equation. So,
There's never been a fascist movement that accepted trans people. Just putting that out there.
mhm, despite what J.K. Rowling wants to say, so she's a Holocaust denier when it comes to uh, gender and
No,
sexual
she literally
minorities.
is.
Yeah, she literally is. She believes that Jews were there, like, and then
Yeah, yeah,
but some of those other people,
yeah.
and we call that Holocaust denialism when it's
It's
applied
still.
to any group of people that you're saying weren't victimized by that.
Mhm.
So, um, we've went pretty long,
We
so we
did.
should
This is our
probably
longest episode.
one last, just a little plug. Uh, Please subscribe to this channel on YouTube. Subscribe to us on our Substack. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook. Those things are above us here. And also, just a little promo shout out. We recently published the Inaction Planner, which sounds like a joke, but it's not. It's this. I'll just read a little bit. Um,
That should be our
planning.
next.
Yeah,
Sorry, that
yeah.
should
We
be our
should
next episode to talk about the myth that you must always be moving or
productive. The myth
something.
of productivity.
Yeah.
Anx- because anxiety and productivity and all the hustle culture stuff isn't just make us sick, it also limits our possibility to be present to other things, and it
Mhm.
makes us our thinking and our judgment cloudy. So this is a resource that I developed mostly um, kind of to help myself, and it helps us build in doing nothing as a regular part of what it means to be human. Rest. Um, Rest isn't, I don't necessarily think rest is resistance, but it's necessary to resistance. And so the Inaction Planner, go to inactionplanner.com, and there'll be a link to our website. You can get it in different ways. Check it out. There's some examples of what you find in this handy dandy little handsome book if you go to inactionplanner.com. So until next time, everyone.
Bye.